Welcome to Hints and Guesses, my podcast. Kent here. I want to begin with a passage from Carl Jung, from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And I'm inviting you to ask a sort of a question about this passage, a simple one. Do you think this is true? When I first read it, something about it sort of pierced me and challenged me and troubled me all at the same time. And it's been in the background of some of my own wrestling over the last couple of years with vocation and how I'm oriented in the world, and am I spiritual, am I religious, and what kind of questions am I carrying? David White has that line where he says, some questions have no right to go away, and it felt like that. There are certain questions in my life that aren't going away, and I wish they would. But here's the passage, and if anything else out of today's podcast, which I've been kind of putting off. I mean, I took July off for a variety of reasons, which I'm going to share with you, but I've been sort of like dragging my feet a bit because I wanted to talk about this passage and kind of some things that have unfolded in the last month or so for me. So here it is. I feel very strongly that I am under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by my parents and grandparents and more distant ancestors. Really. Things left unanswered by previous generations, by parents. I think of my own dad. I had a dream last night where it was time to bury my grandfather, and he was in a casket, and it was, I don't want to tell you the whole dream, but it was kind of like happening in this gymnasium, and I was kind of maneuvering the casket around. In fact, I wheeled it in on this almost cart, and in preparation for the funeral that was going to happen later. And a bunch of men kind of came around and were singing a song, kind of a funny song. Like, I recognized it. I can't think of what the song is now, but kind of like at the end of Monty Python's Life of Brian. Always look on the bright side of life. You know, they're singing that all the people who are being crucified at the end of that crazy film. It was like that. It was kind of a funny song, a folksy song, and I liked it. And it's almost like they were joining me in this sort of irreverent, but also strangely sacred preparation to bury my grandfather. I was like, wow. And I had planned on making this podcast this morning, and I don't know if they're related, but it's just strange. I don't think I've dreamed of my grandfather in a very long time, or if ever, if I even think about it. And this first sentence, just this first sentence, what questions were left incomplete or unanswered? And I come from a long line of preachers. My dad was a preacher. My grandpa was a preacher. And on my mom's side, also preachers. There's more. It often seems as if there were an impersonal karma within a family which is passed to children. Sorry, kind of a bad reading. I'll try again. It often seems as if there were an impersonal karma within a family which is passed on to children. It has always seemed to me that I had to answer questions which fate had posed to my forefathers and which had not yet been answered. Or as if I had to complete or perhaps continue things which previous ages had left unfinished. I don't particularly like this possibility. I think we live in an age that sort of worships the tabula rasa, that we're a blank slate, that we get to choose, that it's a matter of our tastes and proclivities and likes and desires and uniqueness, and to sort of wonder if our ancestors have passed something on to us. We know that genetically. We don't have a problem with that. We say, yeah, we look at, our famous sports figures or artists, and we wonder, well, what was passed on? How did they get so lucky? We would say, and we have no problem saying, well, maybe there's some ancestral component here. But when it comes to the questions we actually carry, our own existential wrestling match with life, with God, with reality, to feel caught up in a lineage that feels kind of stifling. No. In fact, it pushes against the very first poem I ever memorized, Invictus. William Ernest Henley. I memorized this in the 9th grade. Maybe you know it. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. It's a kind of a silly poem to memorize in the 9th grade, as if I had a sense for my unconquerable soul. But it's the kind of poem that attracts a teenager. Okay, so here's the end of it. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And I think it's probably taken me 30 years or more to realize how false this poem is. I'm not the captain of my fate or the master of my soul. Certainly not fate in the traditional sense. Fate in sort of the Greco-Roman world really is a word that describes the circumstances in which we are born, of which we have no say. The parents we have, and the socioeconomic class that we're born into, and our skin color, and our siblings, and that's fate. And here Jung folds into fate the question of our forefathers and their unanswered or incomplete tasks. He says that's actually more like fate. And for me, that's the religious world. I was born in Virginia, but I have on both sides come from this little green island. This little green island where politics and religion were really the same thing. They were tied up, they were bound together, and the troubles, the Protestant Catholic king or crown versus the papacy, and all on an island that had a kind of spiritual backdrop where nature and the church weren't so separate, where God was in the tide and in the wind and in the grass as much as in the hymns and the poems and liturgies of formalized church. And I come from a long line of Protestants who were busy protesting the excesses of not only just Catholicism, but of the Anglican Church and its adoption of hierarchical power. And that's the kind of Protestant tradition I come from. And weird, am I tabula rasa? Am I really a blank slate? Or have I been carrying questions that my ancestors left unfinished, and is part of what I've been up to just the pressures of fate or a kind of karma? And maybe one reason why Jung has so spoken to me is that he came from, I think, 3 or 4 generations of Protestant ministers, which kind of scared me when I read it. Wow, You've heard me quote Jung many times on this podcast, and I wonder why. It's not because I'm trying to be cool or I'm a Jungian or I think Jung is the sole authority and he's become my new guru, and No, it's just every once in a while you run into someone that rings your bell, and he has for me, and maybe it's because we're tied up in similar circumstances. I don't know. And if you've been listening for a while, I've been playing with this kind of religious but not very spiritual kind of line. I think after I left the church formally as a minister, as a pastor, almost 10 years ago now, I've felt resonant with the world of the spiritual but not religious. And I felt a kind of freedom in that. All right, I don't need a system. I can take from the immense spiritual buffet of our modern era what I like and what I don't. I can mix a little Jung with church fathers, and I can do triathlon training instead of spiritual disciplines, or I can listen to podcasts instead of reading sacred texts, and the spiritual but not religious. And I'm not even really putting that down. It was part of the wander that I was on, and I think a lot of people are on, a lot of my friends are on. But the questions of religion, like Heschel says, that philosophy of religion is about discovering the questions to which religion posits an answer. It's like the whole process of really wrestling. Philosophy in the best sense of that word, the love of wisdom, really wrestling with a religious tradition and with saints and mystics and texts and the nature of religious experience, which is what I think ultimately calls to me. What is a religious experience? I think that requires stepping outside of your own privatized, really in the end, relatively narrow experience. Maybe you can never step outside of the psyche. I mean, how we experience anything at all is there's a wildly personal dimension to that. It goes through the lens of our psyche. But in terms of our private tastes and whims and desires and wants and needs, religion blows the doors off that privatized experience and says, yes, but what about the larger field? And a religious life, at least as I've come to understand it, is a life that's oriented toward questions of ultimate meaning, like hell-bent on questions of ultimate meaning. What's at the center? It's not like then religion says, well, this is at the center and you're kind of done. Like, that's fundamentalism, you know. There's something stunning about what Christianity inherited from Judaism is at the center. There's a kind of emptiness. You're not even to know the name of God, really. I am that I am is God's answer to Moses. Or I love the fact that once the Ark of the Covenant, if you know what that is, the box that the Israelites carried around, was taken into Babylon during the first exile in 586 BC. When the temple was rebuilt, all the evidence seems to suggest that what was in the center of the Holy of Holies was nothing. There was no more Ark of the Covenant. I just love that behind the curtain is emptiness, and that's actually, that's appropriate. That's wildly appropriate for the question of what's at the center of existence. What do we mean by God? And anyway, that's sort of why I've been saying I'm religious, but not very spiritual. It's like I have trouble in, living a spiritual life, and but it's sort of maybe I've been broken down enough to admit that actually I'm deeply religious, and that's what I've been chasing. T.S. Eliot says, to kneel where prayer has been valid. And I also didn't like that line. That annoyed me as much as the Jung passage. I didn't want to kneel where prayer had been valid. I just wanted to kneel where I wanted to kneel. Actually, I didn't want to kneel at all. But, so what am I saying? What am I wondering? I'm wondering, in a simple sense, if my own wrestling match with my Protestant Christian tradition, it works a little like fate. And I have some questions that my grandpa and my dad didn't answer. And I don't know exactly what they are. My grandpa didn't, when I think quite literally about this, maybe it's more mysterious, which I think it is, but my grandpa didn't really love questions. He liked quotes. I like quotes too. He was always quoting hymns, really obscure hymns that you've never heard of. If you asked him a question, he'd like quote a whole verse of some Plymouth Brethren hymn that no one's heard of. But he had this like Irish accent, and so it was kind of like, he's like a little leprechaun and casting a little magic spell and sort of avoiding the question, or maybe answering it, but not in a way that was recognizable to me. My dad liked questions, and that's probably one of the things I miss the most. He's be coming up on 10 years since my dad died of ALS, and I can even feel the emotion now, thinking of him. And man, he would have loved to be alive and see my own kids growing up, and we'd be talking about the same things. About religion, about God, about the Bible, about Judaism. He would love my new fascination with Jung. We'd probably argue about that. Anyway, I miss him now as I'm saying these things, and in their wake, what questions have been left unanswered? And anyway, I think I know, at least I think I know what Jung is talking about, that there's an impersonal karma within a family. And I'm being quite open about, what's been messing with me. But I'm asking you, like, if you think about the same things, like what impersonal karma is within your lineage? Like, what unanswered questions, and what did your ancestors carry as far as they could, and then they passed on the baton, and maybe there's the impersonal karma is pressuring you in some way to turn attention, to say, I want to take it further here, in some sense. Do you think it's true? That's kind of what I'm asking. And, Jung has another line: the psyche is not of today. Its ancestry goes back many millions of years. So now that's kind of abstract, because we can just push it back beyond our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. And, you could follow that for a long, long time. But he's saying that the psyche is filled with material that's not so personal. And I think to come to an understanding of that, I think is to live a fuller life. Is to live a life in widening circles that move out across the world, as Rilke says. To expand out beyond just our small sense of self. Like, I love Richard Rohr's really simple, what he calls the cosmic egg of consciousness. The ego is the small self, the I, and that's the smallest ring in this egg. And then out beyond that is the we, and that's a monumental leap, that it's not just about me, but there's a we. But that often gets stuck in tribalism: my tribe, my people, my skin color, my ideology, my political party, you fill in the blank. And out beyond that is cosmic consciousness, God consciousness, Christ consciousness, a sort of blurring of the lines between the totality and the self, and all three of those layers, the I, the we, and the cosmic, it's all one whole. It's not like once we move out to the we forget about the I. We still have an ego. There's still an I in there. But I think this kind of expansion forces us beyond the I am the captain of my fate and I'm the master of my soul. That's ego consciousness. That's I'm in charge of my life. And I'm telling you, in my opinion, I'm not in charge of my life. And it's been a slow and relentless defeat to admit such a thing. Which kind of leads me to some updates on my end. I took a job at a church here in Grand Rapids called Mayflower. And it's a pretty traditional church. It reminds me very much of the church of my youth, which was an independent Baptist church. The pews are the same. The kind of pitch of the floor is the same. White walls, big tall windows, no stained glass. Kind of still inspired from the sort of Puritan architecture and simplicity. And my friend, Ruth Bell Olson, this is actually Rob Bell's sister, who I've known since high school, is the senior minister there. And we just have been chatting up since coming back. And there was an opening there for an interim associate minister position. And we started talking about it. And almost everything about our conversations and about this possibility seemed like, yeah, this makes sense. And I can't even say why. And I sort of have a caution that I don't want to make too big of a story here or try to tell it in a certain way. It's just, to my surprise, I'm back in the church in an official capacity as a minister in a setting that I kind of recognize but also feels pretty new. And I have a lot to learn. And by the way, if you live in Grand Rapids, you should check out this church. It's a congregational church, which means it's really kind of fiercely independent and very much from the ground up. People run, council run, committee run sort of place. And congregationalism, of course, goes back to some of the earliest churches here in the States, which go back to England, which go back to the Protestant Reformation, and a kind of firm belief in the priesthood of all believers, and a kind of dangerous belief that the Spirit is still alive and still speaks, and we don't need a hierarchy here to tell us what God is up to. And that's the DNA, which of course is wrapped up in my own Irish, English heritage here. And one of the cool things about this particular church is that it's an inclusive church, primarily because there is such a deep belief that we can't tell other people what they should believe about God or their personal convictions around faith, around ethics, around morality, that they stand before God. And so it's an inclusive place, and it's very traditional. It's hymns and fantastic organ music. The organist has a PhD in Bach, and so it's like it's keeping alive something that I've been craving for a long time, to harken back to T.S. Eliot, to kneel where prayer has been valid. I mean, there aren't many places left where you can hear choral music and Bach, sort of in the same liturgical space. And so I'll be teaching there once a month, and doing everything else that an associate minister does, which is a whole variety of things. And it's an intergenerational church, which is kind of exciting. There's a huge value on intergenerational relationships. So in other words, there's a mix of people, which I really enjoy. And so I'll see where it goes. And I feel sort of humbled and excited and surprised. And almost as soon as this was coming into focus as a possibility, I was remembering this passage from Jung, like, oh, okay. I'm circling the tower here, and I'm going to return and in a much more formal way to the church and to a certain role in the church. In fact, they even have robes at this church. I've never worn a robe in my life. My dad used to wear a robe every once in a while. This is from the Protestant tradition, these plain black robes with, funny sleeves and pleats. And part of me says, what the hell? Really? I'm going to wear a robe? And there's another part that says, no, you probably should have worn a robe all along. The robe is is a deflector. It says, this is not about me, instead of like cool preachers with their fancy shoes and their hip clothes and their black t-shirts and, tattoos and hip hair and references to, I was going to say to Coldplay. That wouldn't be so hip anymore. I don't know. Kendrick Lamar, like, come on. So I'm entering in a more formal way a tradition in which I'm just lending a hand. And I'm curious about the ways in which it might shape me. And so that's a little of what's going on. And yeah, I'm going to continue guiding. I'm going to negotiate some space so I can continue doing my wilderness programs. I'll continue to meet one-on-one with people. I'm taking a little break from that so I can get kind of oriented. So if you're interested in companion guiding, or if you already are doing that from time to time, know that when September rolls around, I'll have a better sense of kind of my weekly flow. And yeah, so that's a little of what's unfolding. And I don't know, it's like in some ways I'm asking a pretty common and culturally relevant question. It's like the nature-nurture debate, but we could add to it. It's like nature, nurture, and unfinished ancestral questions. It's kind of what I'm wondering about. I think the nature question, what are we born with? What innate structures are there? Is not only a question of sort of DNA and genes and epigenetics and all kinds of other fancy things, and science wants to explain everything through biology, and but nature is not just biology, and that's at least what Jung would say, or they're two sides of the same coin. Even the archetypal world, the patterns, the instincts, the inherited predispositions. It's something like a blueprint for experience. That's the archetypes that are in us. That's also nature. That's like saying the psyche is a couple of million years old. And of course, the nurture, who would deny that we have a personal unconscious and we have personal experience? And parental influence matters a great deal. Our actual father and our actual mother, not to mention our father and mother complex that gets activated and shaped and formed in the midst of our who raised us and our cultural and religious conditioning. There's no question in my own life. Nurture and a particular brand of Baptist fundamentalism shaped who I am, and for better and for worse. And a friend of mine was saying the other day that how much of his parents' Christianity kept the family intact. That's a really interesting comment. Like, the brand of religion kept the family intact. And he said this knowing that there was a lot of very serious family trauma. So it's like, that's, I think, in the realm of nurture. Like, what kind of environment raised us, for better and for worse? And if I think about my own relationship with the church right out of college, starting off as a worship leader and then eventually like kind of getting hooked on the sermon, and how much of that was also just about my dad and my grandpa, for better and for worse. It's just like, okay, it makes sense. So we have our own wounds and traumas and what we repress. And, I just thought of another line from Jung. It's difficult to say where the child's psyche ends and the parent's begins. Yeah, that's also true. That's in the nurture realm. So it's both. It's nature, it's nurture. And I just want to add this kind of third possibility, which maybe is a mixture of both of these things, which is the question of unanswered questions that we've inherited from our immediate ancestors. What's our task here? So maybe I'll just end with kind of three more quotes. Well, maybe two more quotes, and I'll repeat the one I started with, just so you can hear them again and find your own way into an answer, or into the wrestling match in which answers are kind of dangled out in front of you forever, like the rabbit at the dog track. But worth it. Worth the wrestling match. So here's one you've heard me say before. The greatest burden a child bears is the unlived life of the parent. So how is that relevant here? I think if we take seriously that we've inherited something and it's ours to wrestle through and to work through, if we deny that and push that down and don't face more squarely as much as we can the task at hand, the unanswered questions, like, okay, I'm going to really look, then turning away from that becomes the huge burden we put around our kids' necks. We have a chance here. And maybe you don't have kids, but you can think about it more broadly in a generational sense if you want. That when we deny, repress, fail to turn toward, well, we pass on something even more difficult, even more weighty onto our kids. The extreme version of this is something like or the cliched version is something like when you see the dad screaming at their kid, for missing a pitch, or for missing a tackle. Well, the unlived life of the parent is on full display. They haven't really wrestled with the death of their own childhood and their own gifts and talents and failures and stories, and they need their kid. They're trying to live vicariously. Because some unfinished business there. So I'm just saying it matters. Like if we can turn it, like for me, all right, to wrestle with faith, church, God, Protestantism, preaching, being a pastor, the scriptures, the sacred text, the songs, prayer. Okay. Yeah. It's what's mine to carry. Okay, here's another quote. Our souls, as well as our bodies, are composed of individual elements which were already present in the ranks of our ancestors. So that's, again, a kind of, what do you think about that? Our souls and our bodies, the bodies make sense, but our souls really are composed of individual elements which were already present in the ranks of our ancestors, born in certain times and places in the world, certain geographies, certain landscapes that shape them, that form them, certain expressions of faith and God and of worship and prayer, and it's like, okay, it lives in us in some way. And here again is the passage from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. I feel very strongly that I am under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by my parents and grandparents and more distant ancestors. It often seems as if there were an impersonal karma within a family, which is passed to children. It has always seemed to me that I had to answer questions which fate had posed to my forefathers and which had not yet been answered. Or as if I had to complete or perhaps continue things which previous ages left unfinished. Thank you for listening to this podcast, so many of you. And thanks for passing it on to your friends and for joining this conversation. This podcast is not an experiment anymore. It's part of the conversation I'm trying to have in the world. So thank you for supporting it. Thanks to my patron supporters who faithfully support this podcast every single month, even in times when I'm a bit dry, like I took last month off and because of all these changes. And I just want to thank you for your support. And if you want to join the Patreon community, patreon.com/Kent Dobson is the way to do it. You can check my website for some future offerings. I leave tomorrow for an Animus program that's full, a fast, the Animus Quest, we call it, and involves a 4-day fast and a 3-day solo. It's really a beautiful ceremony. And so I'm looking forward to that. And then I don't have anything else the rest of the year, but next year I'll have some more Animus offerings, not to mention my own occasionally. And if you live in Grand Rapids, you should definitely come to Mayflower and come and see me and check it out. So wishing you all depth and beauty and meaning and goodness and hope. And I hope that you'll hear in these words today and these passages from Jung some ideas that will work their way into your heart and some hints and guesses for your own spiritual journey wherever you happen to be.